everybody? It's your boy GS Luke here for our weekly course breakdown, this time for the Travelers Championship. This week's venue is TPC River Highlands, a fan favorite, a caddy favorite, player favorite. There's a reason why this is one of the stronger fields we get every single year, as well as one of the more attended events on all of the PGA Tour schedule. It ranks number 2 in average attendance, only behind the Waste Management Open, which is just on another level of itself. So we're going to get you prepared for everything you need to know this week about the golf course, including my key stats, a hole-by-hole breakdown of TPC River Highlands, as well as some of the comp courses around the PGA Tour schedule that you might be able to use as a comparison this week. So whether you're a hardcore DFS player, an outright bettor, or just trying to get an idea of what to expect this week as a golf fan, we got you completely covered here. So without further ado, a lot to talk about for this week. Let's get right on into it. Alrighty, so we've got TPC River Highlands this week, an absolute gem of a golf course, a fan favorite, a player favorite. There's a reason why this is one of the more attended events of the year, but also a favorite from the players. It is a Pete Dye design, most recently renovated by Bobby Weed since 2016, and one that we have a ton of data on. We've been coming to this venue since the 1970s, and as a result, we know exactly what to expect from the golf course, which, ironically, is to expect the unexpected. Even though this is a short par 70, just 6,852 yards. Pretty much anybody is capable of getting it done around this place. So first off, taking a look at the recent winners, you have winners such as a Harris English, Dustin Johnson, same thing with Bubba Watson, who has won multiple times around this place. But on the other side of things, plotters like a Ches Reavie, a Jordan Spieth, and also a Russell Knox, who get it a lot more done with their iron play than they do with that driver off the tee. So depending on your specific skill set, just bring that to the table, execute your skill set better than anybody else that week, and you can end up taking home the hardware. So perhaps that's why so many players end up coming to this venue, because it is extremely fair. So just hopping into some of the basics for this week, this is a relatively easy golf course. The scoring average is right around a third of a stroke under par. At least that's what we saw in 2021, which is right around a tenth of a stroke easier than most PGA Tour courses. So despite it only being 6,800 yards, you're not going to see a winner in that 20 to 25 under range. Most of the winners over the last 5 to 6 years have been somewhere in that 13 to 19 under range. 13 under was what Harris English won last year in 2021, with the ceiling really being a Dustin Johnson, who won at minus 19 there in 2020. So even though this is a quote-unquote gettable golf course, you're not going to see a wild winning score like what we saw at the Tournament of Champions. In terms of penalty strokes, there are a few out there, and that's despite there only being water in play on 5 holes. There's quite a few out of bounds in play, a few deeply forested areas. So driving off the tee, we'll get to that here in a second, is pretty lenient around River Highlands, but there are a few big numbers out there as well, particularly on the last 4 to 5 holes, which makes for an entertaining finish year in and year out at the Travelers. The greens here aren't one of the defenses. So despite them being small greens, just about 5,000 square foot on average, you're going to hit plenty of them around here. The GIR percentage was 70.3% last year, which is a whole 2.1% higher than what we see week to week on tour. And with those small greens, that means one thing: they are extremely receptive. Up here in the Northeast, tends to be a little bit of a wetter climate this time of year, as opposed to some of those Texas golf courses that can tend to run a little bit firmer and faster. As a result, players aren't going to have nearly as much trouble holding greens, and will also be able to apply spin to the golf ball a little bit easier. So that's why we see that difference. They're running at right around 11.5 on the stimp meter, and they happen to be a bentgrass POA Anua hybrid, very similar to what we saw at Brookline. In the Northeast, you have a mostly bentgrass surface, but a lot of these higher end golf courses will introduce POA into the mix to make them, believe it or not, it's a little bit ironic here as well, a little bit more consistent, right? Bent grass can be a little bit bumpy from time to time, and while POA gets that same knack, when you put the two together, for whatever reason, ends up being an extremely pure surface. So, very similar to the greens we saw last week, just perhaps running a little bit slower towards that 11.5 to 12 range rather than a 13.5 on the stimp meter. The fairways, like I said, extremely lenient. Large fairways, right around 38 yards wide on average, and they're going to play even wider than that. Because it's only a 6,800 yard golf course, you're going to see plenty of players club down off the tee and hit a lot more fairways. So as a result, the fairway percentage was 69.8% in 2021, a whole 3.8% higher than the PGA Tour average, which is a significant difference, even bigger than what we saw with the JIR percentage, which leads you to believe that this should be an extremely gettable golf course. But you got to remember the rough that's out there, and despite them being relatively easy to hit fairways, the penalty for missing them is massive. In fact, right around 0.43 strokes just for missing the fairway. The main cause of that is the length of the rough, right around 4 inches long, and it's also a bluegrass fescue mix. Bluegrass, when it tends to get a little bit damp, get some moisture on it in the morning, tends to play even more difficult to get out of. So hitting the fairways here, going to be important, but because of how wide they are, your ability to club down off the tee, not going to be a problem for some of the more precise players. But now let's hop into that bomber narrative. Usually at these courses where you have such a penalty for missing the fairway, there would be a huge emphasis on driving accuracy. But as we saw with some of those recent winners, that hasn't necessarily been the case. We have winners like a Bubba Watson, who's won multiple times, Harris English even, known for his power over his precision, and especially DJ, who was able to take this to -19, the lowest winning score we've ever seen around this venue. All three of those players took a bomb and gouge approach. We're hitting driver off the tee, and while you can't miss super wide at this golf course, you don't need to be splitting every single fairway to have a chance. Most holes don't have overhanging limbs to worry about. The angles into greens aren't nearly as important because of how receptive they tend to be. So that bomb and gouge approach, even if you're hitting wedges out of the rough, is a solid way to get it done. But on the other hand, you're going to have players like a Ches Reavie, Jordan Spieth, Russell Knox, who just hit a ton of fairways out there, right? Club down off the tee and really leaned into their strength, which for all three of those players is undoubtedly their approach play. So when we start to talk about some of these key stats, it's going to be a lot more nuanced this week. It's going to matter the type of strategy they're employing. If they're going after that bomb and gouge strategy, I am much more worried about their wedge play, also their approach play out of the rough, than I am some of those shorter plotters, where I'm looking for driving accuracy percentage, of course, solid iron play, which is what is going to take you to the top of this leaderboard. But more importantly than anything, everybody has to be able to putt here. We take a look at the top 5 from last year. Every single one of them gained over 2.5 strokes putting. Take a look at the top 10. Every single one of them gained to the field with the putter, and even out to the top 25, all but just 2 or 3 players gained with the flat stick. So that is the one thing that you absolutely have to have around this venue. But from tee to green, there are multiple ways to get it done. So we're going to hop hole by hole here in a second, and that is going to become especially evident. There's a strategy involved for every single hole, whether you're going to be a little bit more aggressive, like a player like a Bubba Watson would, or a DJ, or a little bit more conservative, aka that Ches Reavie, Russell Knox route. So keep that in mind when we're going through this hole by hole. It's a golf course where there's a lot of decisions to be made off the tee. Alrighty, and now for our hole-by-hole breakdown, just to give you an idea of exactly what these players are going to be dealing with. Hole number 1, a handshake of a hole if I've ever seen one, but one where you have to make a decision off the tee. Be more conservative, put yourself in that short stuff, have a middle iron at the most in, or try and be a little bit more aggressive about it, and perhaps have a sand or a gap wedge in hand. So we'll take a look at that. The tee shot that we have it set up for is going to be the more conservative approach, something like a 3-wood, maybe a driving iron off the tee, setting up a reasonable birdie look. But like I said, there are decisions to be made. If you're feeling yourself, you're confident in that off the tee play, perhaps you might push it down there an extra 20-30 yards. Doing so puts you in that 110 to 120 yard range, which with how receptive the greens are around this golf course, is going to be a birdie opportunity for pretty much everyone in the field. Hole 2, another hole you have to make a decision on because it is a quote-unquote drivable par 4. Now, you're not really quote-unquote driving the actual green here. You're not going to see many putts for birdie, but you can put yourself in that 30 to 40 yard pitch range. So just to give you an idea, another hole where it tapers off the further that you push it down here and the more risk that you're bringing on with your off the tee shot. I expect most players to play it conservatively, hit a driving iron off the tee, and leave themselves just a flip wedge in. But you saw players like a Bubba Watson, Dustin Johnson, get a little bit ahead of themselves and push it down there even further. So for those players, you're going to have a 30 to 40 yard pitch up. And if you end up hitting an absolute bomb, like somebody like a Bryson could do, Might even get it up onto the fringe there. So another birdie opportunity, but another hole where you see the choices off the tee that players are going to be left with. Hole 3, another example of that, a hole where you can be conservative, set up a middle iron at the most, but if you decide to push it down there, you bring some of these fairway bunkers into play, some of the rough into play, even the trees over here to the left can gobble up a few tee shots, but you also get handsomely rewarded, right? So if we put the tee shot out there closer to 310, 320 yards, another hole that you could potentially have a gap wedge into. So, very early on, you're getting a feel for this golf course. You have those decisions to be made, and depending on those decisions that you make, it's a drastically different golf course, right? For the first 3 holes, you could be looking at a flip wedge into all of these greens, or anything as large as a 6 or a 7 iron for players that are laying up off the tee. So when we're going through the key stats later, you'll see that I'm catering a lot of those to the player's skill set. The longer players, I'm focusing a lot more on their wedge play, whereas some of the shorter hitters, the plotters, the guys that tend to do it with their accuracy, I'm focusing a lot more on their iron play. They're putting, right? Because they're going to have longer putts. When you have those wedges in hand, you're going to have a lot more of those 5 to 10 footers to make, whereas some of those more conservative players that might hit more greens because they're taking this consistent approach are going to have to make some 15 to 20 footers, maybe even some 20 plus foot putts on these greens. So it's going to be a week where you have to cater your analysis on a case-by-case basis. Hole number 4 is another great example of the risk-reward factor around this place, where you can see the more aggressive you are off the tee, the more that you're rewarded. So for this time, I have it set up for the aggressive drive. If you take it aggressively down the right side, you can leave yourself a middle iron at the most, but a majority of players are going to play this a lot more passively. They're going to hit something like a 3-wood off the tee, put themselves in this large part of the fairway, which still leaves you right about 200 yards in. So I think this is probably the best example of it. The first 3 holes, regardless of your length, you're going to have a scoring club in hand. But on hole number 4, if you want to have a scoring club in hand, you are going to have to bomb it out there. Be somebody like a Bubba or a DJ that can carry it 305, 310 yards in the air. So that's where a lot of this strategy starts to come in. Hole 5, a 230-yard par 3, relatively long hole, right? All the par 3s here are going to have some oomph to them, going to be a lot longer than their par 4 and par 5 counterparts, and you're going to have something like a 3-iron into these. So when we're taking a look at some of our par 3 scoring stats, certainly going to be weighing it towards the longer end of that spectrum. Hole 6 is the first par 5 we've got, going to be reachable by the entire field. Obviously, the longer you are, the better that opportunity is going to be. But I expect most players over their 4 rounds to have a crack at eagle here. So it's not the shortest par 5 on the schedule. 580 yards is no snack, but short enough where everyone can take advantage, and that's important around this place. Like we've said, you have so many choices off the tee, so I'm glad these par 5s aren't 600 yards, right? They're not only reachable by the longest of players. Given that you have all these choices, I want the plotters to have a chance this week, and they certainly do around Highlands. Hole number 7 is a straightforward par 4, 445 yards. Not really that much to speak on here. The more aggressive you are, the more it does bring these bunkers down the right into play. But if you're one of the elite distance players, you can pretty much take them out of the equation, right? If you can carry it 310, 320 yards, aka somebody like a DJ or a Bryson DeChambeau, you can put yourself into an even wider part of the fairway. So if you can get it to roll out up here, you're going to have a flip wedge into this green. So another hole where you have those decisions to be made. Hole 8, a long par 3, over 200 yards, got a little lake in front of it as well. So one of the 5 holes where you do have water, quote unquote, in play, but unless you have a complete miss hit here, not going to cause problems for most of these players. So it is a relatively difficult hole because you have that 200 plus yard approach, but nothing compared to what we're going to see on the back 9. And I guess I should have mentioned this early. This front 9 is where almost all the birdie ops are. On the back 9, you have a difficult hole number 10, and that closing stretch that goes around that iconic lake can cause a ton of problems. A lot of big scores to be had at that part of the golf course. So you certainly want to take advantage while you can on this easy front 9. Hole 9 is another short par 4 and another hole where you have decisions to be made. If you want to be a little bit more conservative off the tee, you have a massive landing area. In fact, it's pretty much unlimited in terms of its width because your landing area from 270 yards goes from the whole way back here, the whole way up to the green essentially. So you can miss left to right all you'd like, but if you want to be a little bit more aggressive about it, it brings a lot more hazards into play. This bunker on the right comes into play. The through bunkers on the left are also a possibility, but you're rewarded handsomely. So if we go ahead and put our shot up here closer to 300 yards, where even the shortest drivers are able to get it, you're going to have what, 90, maybe even 75 yards into this green. A true flip wedge, a birdie opportunity if I've ever seen one, which just again starts to follow that trend that we've established. Hole 10 is a difficult hole. So if you're starting on the back nine, good luck. It is nowhere near the handshake that you had on hole number 1, because first off, you have a out of bounds over here on the left. So this whole area over here is going to be an OB stakes. And then on the right, you have a densely forested area. And if you do get too far to the right, there's out of bounds over there too. So a tee shot where if you're, at 7 in the morning teeing off, you want to pay some attention to, because you could completely ruin your week with your first shot here. Either circumstance though, going to be a difficult hole. Try to get it in the fairway with the best of your ability, and you're going to have a middle iron in here. So like I said, nowhere near the handshake of the front nine, and it really sets your expectations. This back nine is nowhere near as gettable as the front. The most gettable hole though is 11. It's only 156 yards. So rather than 230, 205 yards like we had for those first par threes, this one's on the shorter end of the spectrum. So not all the par threes are going to be super long, but a majority of them are, as we'll see throughout this video. Hole 12 is 411 yards, another hole where you have that risk reward factor. A majority of players will play to the meaty part of this fairway a little bit more conservatively with a 3-wood or a driving iron, but much like every hole around this venue, you can be aggressive if you'd like to. You can take that brace and DeChambeau approach. The fairway isn't that wide, I shouldn't say isn't that narrow further up there on the fairway, but it does bring these bunkers into play, and of course this tree's over here to the left a little bit more. So another hole where you have to make a decision and figure out what to do. And hole number 13 is the shortest of the par 5s here. So it's only 533 yards. This is gettable by everyone in the field. In fact, you can lay up off the tee on this par 5 and still easily reach in 2. So this is going to be, I'd expect, the easiest hole on the entire golf course. Depending on setup, you might see one of those drivable par 4s play slightly easier from day to day, but no matter the setup, this is going to be a birdie opportunity for pretty much everyone in the field, as long as you can avoid that water off the tee, and then of course the water hazard over here to the left side of the fairway and green as well. Hole 14, another short par 4, relatively straightforward, massive fairway here, aircraft carrier sized fairway here at 14, gettable and going to be a wedge in hand for pretty much everyone in the field. Hole 15 is a drivable par 4, and it's drivable for everyone in the field, and one of the more entertaining holes that you're going to see all week. You have the water over here to the left, and one thing to note here is that most people are just going to go for the green. You're going to see like 95% plus, maybe even more than that, go for the green here, because even the layup isn't a bargain. Everything in this area slopes down to the left, so if you hit a shot with any type of hook spin, even in the middle of this fairway, you could very well end up in the water down there. In order to get it on the surface, you have to be able to carry it pretty close to the surface here and over to the right. So you hopefully get a bounce off this mounding here, get it onto the green, but most players going to hit it either over the green or over here to the right. So they're, over here to the right is the least ideal location, just because everything is running from right to left into this lake. If you're able to get it past the green and be able to chip back onto it, a lot of players have success doing so. So going to be drivable for the entire field, and coming down the stretch, an extremely entertaining hole to say the least. Hole 16 is 171 yards, another par 3 over water, and though it's only listed at 170, they just added a new tee box this year. So if we go ahead and zoom back, they added a tee box closer to the fairway over here. So it's going to play closer to 200 yards if they decide to use that tee box location. I expect them to use the one at 171 quite often. I'd expect them to do that for quite a few holes, but might see them change it up a little bit, use that new tee box that they added here in 2022. Hole 17, let's go to that next, is a 411 yard par 4, and you've got this water down the right. To the left side, I believe it's an internal OB, if my memory serves me correctly, but you have a massive hill over there. So you're not going to see many people actually hit it into that area, but if you end up missing on this hill to the left, which is of course going to be a psychological factor, with all of that water to the right, you have no shot at getting onto the screen. It's an extremely graded slope down there. You can see a lot of fans standing on the top of the hill, because you can watch down onto the 17th. You can see a lot of the holes on the other side of this golf course as well from that vantage location, but going to be an absolutely devilish hole. You're going to see plenty of tee shots go into the water, because they know if they miss over here to the left on this hill, it's almost just as dead as in the water. I mean, if you're over here on the hill to the left and you're in contention, you're laying up. you're hitting a wedge down here to that little layup zone there, then hoping to get up and down from there. Because to try and hit a downslope shot, ball below your feet, everything that you don't want as a golfer on hole 17 coming down the stretch, if somebody goes for it and it hits it to like 4 to 5 feet, might be one of the better golf shots that we've ever seen in history. I mean, that's how hard that golf shot is there. So going to be a fun hole to watch, to say the very least. And finally, we got hole number 18, 442 yards. A little bit of a downer when it comes to a closing stretch. I'd hope that hole 17 was actually the closing hole because it has all that drama in play. But another hole where you got to drive it in the fairway. You can be aggressive if you'd like to push it down there a little bit further. If you are aggressive, it brings this fairway bunker into play. Also, a lot of the rough on the right, but not quite the strategic hole that we've seen on quite a few of these other holes, right? A little bit more straightforward, hit it in the fairway, hit it on the green. And though this has a lot of undulation, it's one of the harder greens to putt around TPC River Highlands. It's not going to be the number one difficulty hole by any means, right? It's going to be right around the middle in terms of difficulty, which is why I say it's a little bit of a bummer, right? Usually we like a really exciting closing stretch, but you get that for holes 14 through 17, right? That's the real fun stretch of this golf course. Hole 18, a little bit more of a vanilla hole, but so be it, right? Still going to have a champion crowned come Sunday there, and still going to be a great stretch of golf to watch there on Sunday. All right, now that we've seen the course hole by hole, let's break down the key stats that I'm using for my analysis. At number 1, we're going to have shots gained putting, which might surprise some of you out there that have been watching here on the channel for a while, but this is a golf course where undoubtedly you have to be putting your ball. Last year, all 5 of the top 5 finishers finished in the top half of shots gained putting. And in fact, over the last 5 years at TPC River Highlands, only one player that has finished in the top 5 has lost strokes on the greens. That tells you that to get it done here, no matter your ball striking ability, you got to be filling it up, which makes perfect sense. You're going to see a large amount of players hitting these greens, about 70.3% of them, in fact, which means the real differentiating factor here is how many of those putts you're able to drop. So regardless of how aggressive you are, whether you're somebody who's going to have wedge in hand a lot or some of those middle irons from the fairway, you're going to have to make some of those 10 to 20 footers to separate yourself from the rest of the field. So if you're coming in with bad form with the putting, or you're historically somebody who's not as strong with the flat stick, that's going to be a huge concern for me. And while I'm not going to eliminate everyone from the field that's bad at putting, is going to be a much lower chance of them actually going out there and succeeding. So for guys like a Tom Hoagie, a Sergio Garcia, for example, that don't necessarily get it done with the flat stick all that often, if they're going to find their way into my player pool this week for fantasy, they better be low owned and they better be a solid price tag. So that's certainly something that I'm looking at and why it comes in at number 1. Our second key stat is going to be shots gained off the tee. So as was extremely apparent when we went through it hole by hole, you have decisions to be made. So we're not looking at driving accuracy specifically or driving power. We're looking at just total driving of the golf ball. If you're somebody that can get it out there with their distance and gain that way, great. You're going to have plenty of wedges in hand. If you're somebody that's a little bit more precise, then of course you're going to have a lot more middle irons, but you're going to be playing from that short stuff more often. So if you're an elite level player in either category, going to be a huge boost this week. But now where things start to get a little bit wonky and where my modeling gets a lot more complex this week is with the approach play. Now, depending on your distance off the tee, you could have a wide range of clubs into greens here. I mean, the longer players that are a little bit more aggressive are going to have wedge in play for at least 10 or maybe even 11 of the holes, whereas the guys that are conservative might not have any wedges in hand. The only wedge they might have in hand might be for the second hole, also that 156-yard par 3. But outside of that, a wide range to be had. So we would be remiss not to focus on that, right? Not to focus on the wedge play for the guys that are longer off the tee, and not to focus on the middle irons for guys that are historically more conservative. So that is something that really I don't do at every single golf tournament. It takes me a lot more time to make these models, to go through the player pool. But at an event like this, I think it's extremely important. If you're not looking into that type of analysis, I think it's lazy this week, right? If we're just only looking at wedge play, Ches Reeby's not going to have many wedges in hand this week. If we're only looking at long iron play, DJ's not going to have many long irons in play if he was teeing it up, right? So just understand that it is such a nuanced week, and you would be completely remiss. You'd be a clown this week not to acknowledge that, not to actually try to include that in your modeling. And I know it takes a lot of effort. You have to do this on a case-by-case basis, but it is by far the more effective approach to take on weeks like this. So for my third key stat, we have shots gained approach, but it is weighted based on a player's driving distance. So the longer you are, the shorter those ranges are going to be, the more emphasis there's going to be on those shorter ranges, and vice versa. A few other key stats I'm looking at, first off would be shots gained around the green, and despite there being a high GIR percentage around this venue, the around the green shots are difficult. Like I said, the greens have a lot of undulation to them. There's also a lot of strategy involved, like you could see for that drivable par 4. So being able to have all of the shots around the green is going to be a huge factor here. And this is a golf course where you have a few holes with a rough around the green, and then a few holes with fairway areas. So you can't just, rely on one skill set or the other. At the Brookline PGA Championship, even for Southern Hills, you had a golf course that had a ton of rough around the green, right? Not many fairway areas to chip out of. This week, with that diversity, you can't really choose one player or the other. And all around the green play is going to be a key factor for success around TPC River Highlands. A few other key stats, recent putting form, which is important to even look at in top of shots gained putting. Shots gained at TPC River Highlands, so guys that have had success here and experience here going to get a huge bump in my poll. Par 4 scoring, always important at par 70 setups. And lastly, shots gained at comp courses, which we're going to hop into the comps here in a second. But because this is a short par 70, you tend to see a lot of correlation between these courses. A lot of them that are more precision over power, or at least they open up to field in terms of skill set for success, are going to be things to take a look at. All right, and now for the comp courses. At number 1, we have TPC Potomac at Avenel Farm, which we saw most recently for the Wells Fargo Championship this year. We've seen it a few other times over the last 5 to 10 years with scattered events on the PGA Tour, but in either circumstance, it is another short par 70 that's right around 7,000 yards, where it's all about decisions off the tee. You can take driver off the tee at most holes around Potomac, or something like a 3-iron or a 3-wood. You saw that in play. Rory McIlroy, of course, going out there and having a solid week. Max Homa ended up winning that event, having a very solid week. Just not a surprise, right? There's multiple ways to get it done, but outside of those two bombers up top, it was a lot of those precision type of guys. So kind of similar to what we're going to expect this week. Multiple ways to get it done at both golf courses, and logistically, short par 70s also fits that type of mold. Next up, we have TPC Twin Cities, the home of the 3M Open. And though it is in a different part of the country, very similar setup, right? Short golf course, going to be all about your precision over the power if you're more of a conservative player. But the same thing with TPC Twin Cities is the case for Potomac, right? You can be aggressive off the tee. We've seen guys like Colin Morikawa have success, Matthew Wolff have success. So, obviously Morikawa a little bit more towards that precision side, whereas Matthew Wolff, a bomber of all bombers. So if you're taking a look at some of the stats at both of these golf courses, there's quite a bit of crossover. Putting important at TPC Twin Cities, but more importantly than most, you have a lot of options around that golf course, which is really the key thing that I'm factoring in on this week. And now lastly, we're going to have TPC Deer Run, which we're going to see very soon here on the PGA Tour. So if you're taking a look at comps for Deer Run, we're obviously going to be taking a look at results from this week, but another relatively easy TPC setup where you have tons of options off the tee. You can lay up off the tee if you need to. It's not a relatively long golf course, or of course, try to dissect it with your power. So that's the one real commonality between all three of these golf courses is it gives you options, right? Anybody can win at the 3M Open. Anybody can win at Potomac, or even what we're seeing for this golf course here. So that's really what I'm hunkering down on is these short par 70s where you're getting a very similar type of look in terms of the winner. All right, that's all I've got for this week's course breakdown. Before you hop on out of here, let me know in the comments what you think the winning score is going to be. If I had to take one, I'm going to say 16 under par. I'd expect it to be on the easier side, but nothing crazy in terms of scoring. But go ahead and let me know what you're thinking down in the comments. As per usual, going to have you covered for all of your DFS needs this week, as well as your Prize Picks content, showdown videos over the weekend. So make sure you are subscribed to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss any of that to come. I'm super excited for the Travelers. Obviously going to be a ton of people in attendance, and anytime we get 4 or 5 of the top players in the world teeing it up, going to be a lot of eyes on the sport. So I'm excited for that. Really looking forward to DFS this week, outright betting, all that sort of fun stuff as well. So until then, until I see you guys for those pieces of content, best of luck with this week, and let's get this cash.